us today for this presentation. We're thrilled to be part of this. The session is hosted by the Manitoba FASD Coalition and the Manitoba FASD Family Network. I just want to share an acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the Manitoba FASD Coalition gathers and works on the treaty land of the Manitoba traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Assiniboine, Dakota, and Dene people, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. So today we're going to hear Laura talk about supporting regulation among children and youth with FASD. We're really looking forward to the session today. I know it's going to be packed. There's so much to talk about in this session. I know Laura will do a great job. Laura Bennett is an occupational therapist at the Rehabilitation Centre for Children. She has been practicing for 10 years and currently works with the follow-up programs at the Manitoba FASD Centre. Yeah, as I said, she probably can talk all day, so be prepared. We are able to provide a number of handouts by email, possibly today or Monday they'll be sent out. If everyone could just place their questions in the chat. Hopefully we'll be able to address them at the end of the session. We'll just have to see how it goes. The presentation will be recorded, so that video will be available on the Manitoba FASD Coalition website sometime next week. As well, the slides will be provided. So there'll be an email coming with a lot of information. With that, I'll turn it over to Laura. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Thank you for that introduction and for having me here to speak today. I'm so grateful to everybody for being here on a Friday, and I'm really looking forward to trying to bring this big topic into focus and explore how we can support regulation among children and youth with FASD. And I have to apologize, it's my fault that we're starting a little bit late, but I want to tell you, I was having some computer troubles. And I was joking as we came on that it's always the days where I'm doing a presentation about regulation where something like that happens. Like I just have to be dysregulated before we're doing a presentation about regulation. So apologies that we're getting a bit of a late start. So I'm going to spend a bit of time here just explaining who I am and kind of getting situated. I like using this photo a lot because it shows how we're all in different points. And in today's case, we're even in different parts of the province. And I'm going to describe things today from my vantage point as an occupational therapist and just as who I am. But we may have different perspectives on things. People in this presentation might have different experiences, and that's okay. That's a good thing. But let me tell you a bit about who I am, what's my vantage point, why am I here today? So as Andrea mentioned, I'm an occupational therapist. I think I mentioned already, my name is Laura Bennett. I use she, her, they pronouns. I live in Pinawa with my family where we love to play outside. And so that's a great fit for us. As you can see here in this little photo of us on the suspension bridge out by Pinawa. I've been working at the Rehab Centre for about 10 years, 9 of which have included a focus specifically on FASD. And part of what drew me to this career was some of my own living experiences with having a hidden disability. I have ADHD, and there are lots of neurodevelopmental disabilities among people and children in my family. So the experiences of children with hidden disabilities just lands very close to my heart and is a big part of kind of shapes how I approach my work. And so I bring some of that into these conversations as well. I feel very passionate about serving children and with FASD and their families, and have been so inspired by the children I've had the honor of working with over the years. And so every time I do a presentation like this, I have like a renewed sense of gratitude for everything that they've taught me over the years. And I'm going to do my best to try to pay that forward, some of that forward to you all today. So I would love to hear a little more about how you are. It's always so strange doing these types of things virtually because I don't get a chance to see your faces and hear from you. So if you're comfortable, just pop in the chat a little bit kind of grounding of where you are today, what's something that you have with you. I have my coffee. And if there's anything in particular that you're hoping to get out of today's session, you're welcome to pop that into the chat as well. And in terms of why we're here, we're going to spend some time talking about what is regulation. First of all, what do I mean when I say that? What are some of the things that underlie that great big skill? So things like sensory processing, brain development, and just development in general. What are some of those things that go into that brain-based skill? We'll talk through some strategies, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions or discussion, but if not, I can also circulate my contact information if people want to talk more about this afterwards. And as Andrea mentioned, there's going to be some resources sent about. One of the resources that's going to be circulated is a brand new webinar that was put together by therapists here at the Rehab Center for Children about regulation. And so if you're wanting to learn more about that, a link to that webinar will be sent out as well. Today might feel like a lot of information. I'll probably be talking fast and I apologize. So please feel free to do what you need to do to take care of yourself in this session. And also just keep in mind that it's being recorded and that some of those resources will be circulated too. So what is regulation? I'm going to start first by telling you what regulation is not. So regulation is not the same thing as appearing calm all the time. It's not even feeling calm all the time. And when I saw this little picture, I had to laugh because it just, I don't know, struck me funny, keeping calm and pretending everything's okay. Sometimes we can put a little bit too much focus on, calming down, and we might inadvertently send the message that other feelings aside from calm are wrong or bad or things to be avoided. And it's really important that children have the opportunity to learn to notice and respond to all their emotions and all their body states. And that's really the skill that we're trying to get at. So regulation is the dynamic ability to monitor and change your level of arousal to fit the task at hand. There's a lot of jargon in that sentence. And so when we think of level of arousal, we mean kind of that pulse of energy that we have in our bodies. Sometimes that feels like your engine's kind of revving, or you've got lots of energy, or you might feel kind of slow and sleepy and sluggish. So that level of energy that we have and our emotional levels that we have in our bodies. It's dynamic in that it's not a skill that once we've gained it, we can use it consistently the same way each time. There's lots of different things that might influence our ability to regulate on a day-to-day and moment-to-moment basis. And a lot of us kind of know that from our own experiences. So for instance, I might be able to tolerate the stresses of driving fairly well, but when I add in, maybe I'm late, the roads have been icy, it's foggy out, I didn't get my coffee, and I skipped breakfast, well, then if someone cuts me off, I might react a little bit differently to that stress. So different things can influence our capacity for regulation. And that's just a normal part of the skill of regulation. It's especially important to keep in mind in the context of FASD, because one of the ways prenatal alcohol exposure can impact brain development is such that they may have good days and bad days. And so there's a neurological basis for that. And so there might be days where regulation comes a little bit more readily and other days where it doesn't. And that's just something we can expect in the context of prenatal alcohol exposure. And it really is about adjusting to fit the task at hand. And so again, it's not always about being calm. There might be times where it's really appropriate to be not calm. And so it's about trying to find that goodness of fit. And so when we look at the pictures on the screen here, the first one, this little cutie who's fallen asleep at their high chair. So that's maybe a time where their level of arousal is too low for the task at hand because they're trying to be alert and eating. But if we imagine the same child lying in a bed, perfect fit. That's the right time to have a low level of arousal in your body. If we have a look at these kids here who are jumping on what looks like a bed, and so maybe it's bedtime and they're supposed to be settling down, but instead they've got all this high energy in their bodies, that's tricky. That's not the right time to have high energy in your bodies. But if we imagine them at a trampoline park and it's a birthday party, great. And so we're always thinking about regulation for what, because regulation might look different in different situations. Being regulated for a virtual presentation like you're all attending right now looks really different than being regulated for a dance party. So we're thinking about fit. And that also requires us to be able to read some of the context cues in the different places that we are and some of those unwritten social rules that guide our behavior. So I need to be able to notice and figure out what's expected here and adjust my level of arousal accordingly. And so that can be a challenging social thinking skill for some children with brain-based differences. And it can be another reason why it might be harder for children with FASD to use their regulation skills in different contexts compared with neurotypical peers. And so the act of regulating involves modulating or adjusting my emotions, my actions, and my thinking in response to the environment, the situation, and whatever it is that I'm trying to do. So if I come into a room and I'm really excited because something really cool just happened in my life and I want to tell my colleagues about it, but then I notice, oh, something, maybe something upsetting just happened. People's body language is telling me something different. I might in the moment make some adjustments to my level of arousal to be a better fit. So it's all of that thinking in the moment and adjusting in the moment. Regulation is also, it's a really complex skill set that takes a long time to develop. So it's developed over the lifespan. And for many neurotypicals, this skill isn't fully developed until the late 20s, even when the prefrontal cortex reaches maturation. So it makes a lot of sense why so many children have trouble with the skill of regulation. It's because they might not have the infrastructure yet to support that skill. And that's why you're going to hear me using the word regulation instead of the word self-regulation too. Self-regulation has become a little bit of a buzzword, and a lot of people use it in the same way that I'm going to be using the word regulation. But many therapists, myself included, have a bit of discomfort with that term, because to say self-regulation kind of suggests that the child will be able to do it on their own. They're going to self-regulate. They're going to do it. But from a developmental and a brain-based perspective, this is really unrealistic and kind of an unfair expectation. It would be more appropriate to expect that the child that you care for will need some level of support from a trusted adult to learn and to use this tricky skill. And despite what this picture on the screen here shows, research also tells us that the path to regulation is not linear. So there are times where we might expect things to kind of regress a little bit, like when the brain is going through a really rapid period of growth or reorganization, such as in toddlerhood or adolescence. Those are times where regulation becomes more challenging. And also in the event of a traumatic experience or big changes in life, it might be harder for us to access those skills. So it's not a linear path. And we also know that it's not a skill that just develops all by itself with maturity. It's very influenced by our early lives, interactions that we have with caregivers that create sort of a blueprint for future learning. It's an experience-based skill. And so it's something that we have to do and experience together in order to learn, to eventually be able to do it on ourselves more effectively. So we think of it as a we thing. And I would suggest that probably all of us to some point in our lives still look for co-regulation and other outside supports to help us through big feelings. If you have a hard day or something stressful happens or someone does cut you off in traffic, you might talk to a friend about it or look for a hug or vent. And so those are ways where we lean on each other for this skill. And that's a really normal human thing. Oops, because indeed we are social beings. We know that, humans are social creatures and we're not made to do all this alone. Which is why we're going to focus so much of our attention and strategies on the concept of co-regulation when we get into our conversation about strategies, how we can do this together. So co-regulation is when a caring person helps another through their big feelings. It's the only way that humans learn how to regulate, by starting with co-regulation. And we're going to talk more about how to do this when we get to strategies. So I'm going to shift gears just a little bit to talk about sensory processing, brain function, and development, and how these factors can influence the brain-based skill of regulation. So for pediatric OTs, it's very common for us to be asked, is this brain or is this behavior? And the short answer to that is yes. It's kind of a both and situation. And so people ask us this question because they're trying to sort out how do they respond to whatever it is that's happening right now. Is just a child crying or running away or hitting because they're trying to get a certain outcome, which would be behavior, or because they're in distress, which would be brain? And the answer is that, it's both at the same time, because all of our behavior is guided by brain function and brain development. And so that's why we think about behavior is kind of like a window into a person's brain. It can bring to the surface things that we might not be able to see that are going on inside for them. And when there are brain differences, as in the case of a neurodevelopmental disability like FASD, it's reasonable for us to expect that we will also see behavior differences as well. With that thought, it's important to note that no two brains are the same. And this is true of all of us, regardless of whether or not a person has a neurodevelopmental disability. Each of us is just unique. So you may have heard the term neurodiversity. Neurodiversity is a big topic in of itself that we won't get into today, but it encompasses this idea that it's natural and normal to have variety among human beings in terms of how our nervous systems work, how we each think, learn, feel, and experience the world. And it's important to keep this in mind when we talk about strategies, because with strategies, when we want to really target them to the person, we're thinking that one size fits one. And so we want to make sure that we're getting to know who we're helping and make sure it's a good fit for them. And that can seem kind of daunting. It's nice when I could just say, here's the thing to do and it will work in all the situations. But so that's hard that there's not, one size fits all kind of approach. But if you do take just one thing away from today's presentation, you could take this away. This would be a good thing to really focus on. And that's the idea of compassionate curiosity. So compassionate curiosity is this curiosity without judgment. It's how we help children become aware of their inner lives, their body states, help them reflect on their emotions and the reasons for their behavior, and just develop those introspective kind of reflection skills. And the more that we can approach things with that open-hearted curiosity, the better positioned we are to be able to help in a meaningful way. So I'm using that age-old iceberg analogy. And since regulation is a brain-based skill that shows up through behavior, we want to become really adept at noticing behavior and getting curious about what's going on underneath of that behavior. So we might see something on the surface, but there's always a reason going on underneath. And oftentimes the behaviors that challenge us are the ones that are related to an unmet need. So maybe a child has a need that they're trying to seek connection for, they're trying to cope with, there's something they're trying to communicate. And so we want to get curious about what that need is. And I remember being in a workshop with Kim Barthel, who's an OT, who's kind of a bit of a guru in this area. And she said something that's really stuck with me over the years, which is you can't punish away a need. And so if a child is hungry and expressing that hunger through whining, for example, you could scold the child for whining. You can reward them if they stop whining or if they say their request in a way that's more palatable for the grownups around them. But even if that child stops whining, they may still be hungry. And so we haven't addressed the need that was driving the behavior that we were trying to intervene with. And so I'm curious, if we think about some of the behaviors that go along with, dysregulation, what are some of the things that come to mind? What are some of the things that we see? What does it look like? So I'd invite you again to pop in the chat if you could just reflect for a minute. When you think of dysregulation, I presume many of you came here with a child or certain children in your minds. So what are some of the things, without naming anyone or anything like that, and respecting confidentiality, that you might see? And I know for me, for the children in my life, some of the common ones might be things like spitting, swearing, running away. Sometimes laughing can be an early sign that someone's not feeling calm on the inside or feeling, bothered or upset by something. Withdrawal. And so underneath all of those behaviors, there's some kind of need that's coming out in distress. And as helpers, we really want to tune into that question. What's causing this distress? We want to chase the why of what's happening. Often when we talk about regulation, we can get kind of roped into focusing on the things that we see on the surface and measuring our success by whether or not those behaviors have reduced. So I might think, oh, they're spitting, and what I'd really like is for them to stop spitting. And so I'm going to measure my success by, has the spitting stopped? But just as the child might stop whining for food while still feeling hungry, a child might stop spitting but still feel in distress. And so we want to make sure that we keep our curiosity on to figure out what's happening, why, and underneath of that, and try to meet that need. And so that's why I sometimes shy away from any intervention or strategy that places a really high emphasis on being calm, because as we mentioned earlier, regulation isn't the same thing as being calm all the time. And I just like this phrase from Dr. Becky Kennedy, who's a child psychologist who shares a lot of information on social media with parents and resources for parents. And it's that mantra that we can have in our minds when we're supporting a child who's in distress, that my child is a good kid who's having a hard time. What does my child need in this moment? And getting curious about that. One of the handouts that will be provided in an email following this presentation is this slide, which just shows some potential things that it could be, that if you're wondering that, you might look back to and get curious about if it could be any one of these things. that might be underlying the child's behavior. So we're going to spend a few slides with this iceberg analogy and exploring some of the other factors that might underlie behaviors of distress in the context of FASD. And I'm using the term behaviors of distress on purpose because I find it's replacing for me what I previously would have thought of as challenging behaviors or as dysregulation. And I'm changing that for myself because I find that the way that those different phrases land on me impacts how I show up in the moment for the child. So for me, when I think this is a challenging behavior, I think of a challenge and it's me versus the challenge and I have to overcome the challenge, and it puts me in this oppositional stance. And I can feel that I bring some of that energy into my interactions with the child. When I say dysregulation, for me, dysregulation sounds, I'm not saying that these are bad words, by the way. I'm just explaining why I'm using something different. But for dysregulation, to me, it sounds kind of pathological, like there's something wrong. And until I've explored why something's going on, whatever they're doing might actually be a really good strategy for the thing that they're trying to cope with. So maybe they're running out of the classroom for a really good reason. And it's not actually dysregulation. It's actually a really smart regulation strategy. And I just don't understand it yet. Whereas when I find, if I think of behaviors of distress, then I think of a child being in distress and I think, oh, I want to help them. It's an approach feeling and my body changes and it softens. And so I'm just aware of how attuned kids are to the energy that I bring into those situations. And I find when I replace what I think about this moment, it has an impact on how I show up. And so that's why I'm using the term behavior of distress. And that's some language that comes from the low arousal method. So the first one that we're going to explore is sensory processing. So there are our bodies rely on information from 8 different sensory systems to make sense of the world around us through our sight, through our smell, taste, touch, hearing, and also making sense of the world within us as well. And so things like, am I moving? How much force am I using? Where's my body in space? And also things like, am I hungry? What's my heart rate doing? Am I hot? So we use these 8 different sensory systems to give us information about the world around us and also the world within us. And the brain is receiving thousands of pieces of sensory information each second and is constantly working hard to sort out everything that comes in through our senses. There's a part of the brain called the amygdala, which has a big role in this. It functions as kind of like the alarm system in the brain. And so all of our sensory experiences pass through the amygdala, and the amygdala decides whether or not that experience is safe or a threat. It doesn't do a lot. It's a pretty primitive part of the brain. It's not a whole lot of higher order thinking here. It's just threat, safe, threat, safe. And so if something is deemed a threat, then the amygdala will sound the alarm button, and the nervous system will be flooded with adrenaline and cortisol, and our stress response is activated. So we're kicked into that fight, flight, freeze response. So let's say, for instance, the scratchy tag on my shirt, if my amygdala says, threat, we hate that, threat, then I go into my stress response in my body, and that experience is tagged with those chemicals and stored in my long-term memory. So the next time that scratchy tag comes along, the amygdala says, hey, we know you, threat, and it triggers that all again. So if a person is extremely sensitive to a specific sensory input, or if they have a difficult time organizing sensory information, they might find themselves in fight, flight, freeze a lot. And it's pretty common for children who have brain-based differences to also have differences in how they process sensory information. So their amygdala might be triggered by experiences that seem harmless to people who don't share that sensory difference. So if tags for me feel really, really spicy and uncomfortable and I hate them and it's terrible, and my reaction to tags then might seem really confusing to somebody who might not even notice that about their clothes. And I'm not being facetious. All of my clothes have tags cut off because that does actually bother me. So, but it's going to be really confusing to somebody who doesn't share that. And so we sometimes describe this as sensory overload when your fight, flight, freeze response gets triggered due to sensory input. And so if you're noticing behaviors of distress in your child, it's a good time to pause and maybe wonder about what are the sensory experiences they're having? Could that be why I'm seeing what I'm seeing? And I mentioned that there are 8 sensory systems, so I do just want to highlight one in particular, which is interoception. It's shown by this poor little one, who has the tummy ache, but the interoception systems receive input through our body's internal organs. And so that's things like my tummy that tells me I'm hungry, my temperature that tells me I'm hot or cold, my heart rate that goes up or down. And so it's really important information for taking care of my basic body needs, which can also affect regulation. Because if I don't notice I'm hungry and then I don't eat, then I might get hangry, and that's going to show up like behaviors of distress. But it's also important because that's a way that we feel our feelings. So the way that I know that I'm getting frustrated is that my heart rate's gone up, my breathing rate's gone up. I might feel a little bit like tense in my tummy, and I'm noticing those things. And that's giving me clues to say, I need to take care of this because I'm feeling something in my body. If I don't notice those things, or if I'm so sensitive to those things that I find them distressing, then I'll have a hard time using the strategies at the right time. And that's why we sometimes see it seems like kids go from like 0 to 100 really quickly, because they might not be noticing what's building. Or they might have one small experience and it feels like way too much. So interoception is a really important piece of the sensory picture when it comes to regulation. And Kelly Mahler has done some good work around curriculums and programs and things to support kids in developing that skill. Behaviors of distress might also have to do with brain differences that go along with FASD. And while FASD is a whole body diagnosis, I recognize that today I'm focusing more on the brain because regulation is such a brain-based skill. That said, if someone with FASD is experiencing an illness or another health condition or higher rates of pain or physical discomfort that's related to their diagnosis, that can also impact regulation because it's really hard to function if you're feeling pain or discomfort. So a good other thing to just be curious about is, could there be something going on within the body that I'm not aware of? But we've talked a little bit today already about the stress response. It's important to keep in mind in the context of FASD because prenatal alcohol exposure can disrupt the development of the part of the brain that is involved in the stress response systems, meaning that people with FASD may be more sensitive to stress and may be more likely to have a stress response triggered. People with FASD are also more likely to experience adverse childhood experiences. So the rates of adverse childhood experiences tend to be higher among children and adolescents with FASD compared to other disability groups in the general population. And so you have folks who have a nervous system that's more vulnerable to the effects of stress and who may also be having more stressful experiences. And so it creates this difficult blueprint for learning the skills of regulation. Other stressors that people with hidden disabilities may experience is this whole phenomenon of masking. So I'm not sure if people have heard of that before, but masking is really common among individuals with hidden disabilities. It's where they may be doing things on purpose or even not registering that they're doing it, but to try to hide or minimize their symptoms so that it's not registered by others, or so that they can try to sort of fit in. This whole idea of being a square peg in a round hole, trying to find a way to fit in places that maybe aren't a natural fit for the way that you think and learn. And over time, it can lead to burnout and other mental health impacts, this idea of masking. Personally, I can relate to the feeling of having been a student with ADHD, how much energy and effort I spent trying to sit still in a body that didn't want to sit still and look like I'm paying attention when it took all of my brain power to pay attention, sit still. And by the end of the day, it was so tiring. And it's really common too for children to experience this allostatic load buildup. So they're carrying all of these things. They're working so hard to try to inhibit these things or try to make it through the day that one more thing happens and it can feel like this weirdly too big reaction to one small thing, when maybe actually it was because 100 things that we didn't know about were happening and building and building and building in their systems. Or it might mean that finally they get home at the end of the day and they're in a space where it's safe to unmask, and we see what we consider kind of like that after school restraint collapse phenomenon where they kept it together all day long, and then now that they're home, they just can't anymore, and it comes out in big behavior at home where they feel safe to unmask. And so we can feel kind of perplexed about why is this happening, and also maybe why one small thing set them off, but there might actually have been so many things building up in the day that they've been having to try to do that work over time. So that's a common issue too among people who have hidden disabilities. Another thing that's underneath of the iceberg could also be just development. So children with FASD may obtain certain developmental sequences at different ages than their peers, and we call this dysmaturity. So chronologically, they may be a certain age, but developmentally, their skills may be in different places. And so earlier I talked about how regulation is not developed in a linear way. There are bursts and regressions across the lifespan. So a couple examples of what this could look like in FASD. So children might be, at the age where they're going through some hormonal changes, the same time as their peers. They're at that age, that's happening, that's typical development, but they may not have some of the other skills that assist with navigating and coping with that difficult time of life. And so it might make puberty and early adolescence an exceptionally challenging time when there's these normal changes that are happening, but perhaps not skill sets at the right point to match that and to help them navigate. And so that can be really difficult. The development of other skill areas can also impact regulation. So if we think of things like language skills, as children gain more language skills, they gain more ways to express their emotions and needs. They tend to experience less frustration. And conversely, children who may have difficulties with expressive language might use their behavior to communicate a need or an emotion that they're having. And so it might be also a reflection of their development in other skill areas that are impacting their regulation. And sometimes we also think about the fit of expectations. So sometimes, what looks like dysregulation or a behavior of distress in the problem is regulation might be because we're expecting them to do something that they're not able to do yet. So sometimes things like kids who have a lot of trouble with writing, they might have to work really hard at that, and that's difficult for them. And then it comes out in expressions of frustration and leaving the classroom or refusing to do their work. And we think, oh, the problem's regulation, but maybe actually the problem has to do with another skill area like writing or motor skills. And we want to make sure that, we're matching our expectations for where the child is at developmentally. So, thinking back to the idea that it takes about until age 25 or older to have the brain architecture to be able to self-regulate, and then we hear adults say things like, make a good choice when a child is in distress, and they actually may not be able to at that time because from a neurological perspective, they haven't developed that skill yet. So just thinking too about development and matching our expectations with where a child is at. So these are some ways that we can take that approach where when we see behaviors of distress, we can approach it with that compassionate curiosity. Maybe it's one of these other things that are complicating the picture and making it difficult for this child. We're always bearing in mind that children do well if they can. And so if they're not doing well with a certain thing, it's because something is making it so that they can't. And so we want to be thinking about what is it? What's going on underneath? This is another handout that will be going out, but it's from, it's based on some work by Stuart Shanker, who wrote the book Self-Reg. And it's about reframing from a they won't do it perspective to a maybe they can't yet perspective. And for children with FASD, it might be maybe they can't yet, or because we know that a child's capacity and skills might vary day to day, that maybe they just can't today. Maybe they can't this time, and we can try again another time. So when we can do that perspective shift and gain that curiosity approach, it allows us to see things differently, which will let us try things differently, and it will expand our options for strategies and often let us come from a place of greater love and compassion and empathy when we're able to have that curiosity and try to figure out what's going on. One thing that I failed to mention when I was going through some of these pieces is it's also really important to recruit the person with in-body experience when we're trying to make sense of the why. Sometimes we forget to do that, to check in with the child and say, what's going on? Or what's this like for you? What are you experiencing? How do you make sense of this? And so, it's Ross Green's collaborative practice solutions approach talks about that, wanting to really think about engaging the child, the person who has that in-body experience, to help make sense of what's going on for them. So that should have been another slide about looking underneath the iceberg, is about there can be a step where we ask the child and we ask the person that we're trying to support, what's this like for you and how do you make sense of this? So speaking of trying things, we're going to talk now about some strategies. So there are so many different approaches that people can take when they're working on the skill of regulation. Some are a better fit than others for children with FASD. I mentioned already the collaborative and proactive solutions approach. The low arousal approach is another one that's had quite a bit of success. I mentioned, Kelly Maller's work with the interoception piece. And so a lot of these can have some useful applications, but it might require some thinking and reasoning about how to make them a neurodiversity affirming fit and a good FASD approach. And it can be kind of overwhelming sometimes to look at all of these different approaches, all these different strategies, all the different things that are out there to try to help with regulation and know where to start and what to do. And so what I want to focus on is about how we can use ourselves to support children with regulation as a starting point. Because we know that that's really such a foundational piece. We can try all of these different approaches, but if we don't have that good relationship, then it's going to be difficult for them to be successful. So we're going to start with that. And I like this quote here that, it's not so much about teaching self-regulation, it's about giving the child experiences of co-regulation over and over and over again, because it lays that foundation in our brains. And so while curriculums, approaches, and toolkits can all be really, really helpful, all you really need is you. So you are an excellent strategy. And so that's what we're going to focus on for the next little bit. Some of the neuroscience that supports this is about the idea of building pathways. So when we can do regulation together, it gives the child's brain a chance to lay that groundwork. So the picture here that has the path through the snow, that's what comes to mind for me. The more that we travel that path, the more well established it is and the easier it is for us to use that pathway in the future. So the more that I give children experiences to kind of come alongside me and regulate together, the more that they're practicing that and traveling that path, and then the more likely that they're going to be able to navigate that themselves down the road. And we can also think of this idea of mirror neurons. So primates have this because we're social creatures, that we kind of mimic each other unbeknownst to ourselves. It's not on purpose, but why, if someone in here were to yawn and we saw that, other people might yawn. If I yawned right now, some of you might all the way across my screen might even yawn at home. And so and I might yawn now that I've said that many times, but that's because of our mirror neurons. And so we can kind of hijack that system a little bit. If I'm calm in my body, if I'm taking slow, calm, deep breaths, then it's kind of in spite of ourselves, we start mimicking each other and doing it too. So if we're showing that and modeling that, then the kids might pick that up and do that as well. And so earlier I introduced the concept of co-regulation, and now we're going to explore it a little bit more about what that means and how to be a co-regulator. These are some of the qualities that go into being a co-regulator. So a co-regulator is somebody who's curious, who's accepting, who's consistent, someone who is focused on that relational safety, so making sure that the child has that felt sense of safety with me. Someone who's non-judgmental, the idea of being deliberate, so you're doing it on purpose. You're responsive, you're on, you're prepared, you're in the moment. Playfulness can go a long way for being a co-regulator, being willing to try again, and somebody who's empathetic and who's attuned. And we sometimes use this analogy of paddling the river. If you watch the webinar from the RCC therapist that will be sent out, you'll hear it again, and it's explained a little bit more in depth. But if we imagine ourselves out for a paddle with a child in a boat, the way that we engage and the way that we show up will be different depending on what's going on. And so, this is a picture of my child when we were out paddling, and it's a beautiful day. The water's clear. He's ready to paddle. He's in it, and I can probably sit back, take some pictures, relax. I don't have to do as much because he's able to do it. And so we can kind of, just enjoy the moment. If the water starts to get choppy, if it starts to pick up, if there's a little bit of things start to get a little bit rocky, well, then my stance is going to change. So I have that attunement. I'm kind of reading the conditions and how do I need to respond differently based on that. So my role as a co-regulator might change now. I might need to be a little more active. I might need to be doing more of the paddling. I'm kind of gauging what's his capacity here. How is that shifting and changing? Do I have a plan in mind for if I need to, seek safe harbor, and starting to just have that more active stance, that more on stance, and a more aware. If things get really rocky, then I might not expect him to paddle at all. I might be doing all of the work and owning all of the work and just kind of seeking safety and getting to shore until that passes and we're in, able to make a different plan and re-engage together. So if you're a metaphorical thinker like me, that kind of helps me think through how my role as a co-regulator isn't always going to be the same. It's going to change and depending on what's happening with the child that I'm supporting. That's that attuned piece and the responsive piece. These are 6 things that can support co-regulation that we'll talk through. And what I don't really talk about in this presentation are some of the really important proactive things that we can do to establish that co-regulating relationship and to avoid some of that escalation. And those things are really important. It's available in some of the resources that will be going out after today. It's available in the webinar that's going to be circulated. And those are really important pieces, but I'm going to be talking a little bit more about some of the things that we can do in the moment. So when those behaviors of distress are occurring, how do we navigate those moments when kids are already showing us some of that dysregulation? So the first one we're going to talk about is finding your own calm, and it's way easier said than done. But we think about emotions as kind of like waves. They build, they crest, and then they pass. And so we're trying to find ways that we can keep our composure and sort of ride that process alongside the child and be a partner with the child in that. This quote that often comes to mind is like a mantra that when little people are overwhelmed by big emotions, it's our job to share our calm and not join their chaos. So there is a risk because we also are attuned people to the child that we could escalate with them. So if they're escalating, we don't want to be a co-escalator. We want to try to find a way to be a co-regulator. And so to do that, we have to have our own calm. And again, it's so much easier said than done. So it involves a lot of self-compassion, thinking a lot about what are some of the things that help you feel resilient. So I mentioned that idea of, sometimes I can tolerate the stress of driving, no problem. But then when you add on, I'm tired, I'm sleepy, I missed breakfast, I'm running late, what are some of those things that I know are going to empty my tank and give me less resource that I can draw from, and how do I avoid some of those things? And also, what are some of my glimmers? What are some of those little triggers of joy that help fill up my tank? So maybe it's laughing with a friend or listening to a comedy show or certain songs on the radio, things that I can do that will help fill that back up so that I'm well resourced to do this hard job. And how do you take care of yourself when you're feeling stressed too? Because we're also wired for that attunement with our child. So it impacts us. We should expect that when kids get escalated, we might also find our heart rates going up and our, breathing rates going up, and that's normal. I just want to share this with you because it's from science about avoiding burnout, but the importance of completing our own stress cycle. And so sometimes when we are in the co-regulator position, in the moment, we might not be able to actually regulate because we might find that we're escalated too. And we might not have the time or the opportunity in the moment to really actually truly deal with that feeling of stress in our bodies. We're kind of in suppression mode. And so we might be just not so much feeling calm, but sort of finding a way to access appearing calm in the moment to try to ride the wave with the child. But then we need to, if that's the case and we have that stress response in our body, we need to make sure that we still deal with that later so it doesn't just build up. So if there's been a hard day with a child or a hard moment with a child and you've had to have that, navigate that stress in your body, make sure that there's a time afterwards where you can do something to discharge that stress and complete that stress cycle. And this is research from Emily Nagoski, who writes about, our stress cycles are meant to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And it's for short-term survival kind of stuff. So things that can help do that might be things like, exercising your body, giving your body the sensation that you have run away, you have fought off the threat, 5 wall push-ups or, doing some stretches, deep breaths, a tight hug, something that feels restorative. So make sure that if you have had a difficult day or moments with, as a co-regulator, that you carve out some time to complete that stress cycle so it's not just building. These are some other ideas of things that you can do that have kind of a hacking neuroscience way of calming our nervous system. So things that are sour or salty, that heavy work through your body, having cold, like splashing cold water on your face or using an ice cube on your wrists, taking deep breaths. These are some things that can help cue our nervous system that, hey, we're safe. We can be okay now. And just a reminder that it's really important to give yourself the opportunity to do that. It's really important that, you know, being a co-regulator is very taxing and takes a lot of different kinds of energy. And so it's important to prioritize that, and it's okay to do that. Thinking about nonverbal communication, definitely important that we're cognizant of the words we use, but oftentimes the energy that we bring in, I mentioned earlier why I'm thoughtful about the thoughts I'm having, is because even if we're not saying something, our presence can still communicate things loud and clear. And sometimes children can be very attuned to that energy that we give off. And if our nonverbal communication doesn't match what we're saying, it can be very unnerving and contribute to more escalation. So thinking about things like, what's my face doing? That gleaming, beaming, the soft eyes, you know, we kind of look at babies like that, like, oh, you know, not a huge, like, might not always be smiling while a child's escalated, because that would be inappropriate and probably unnerving too. But just that, you know, being cognizant of what your face is doing, and are you cueing the child that, you know, I'm okay. Thinking of that slow and low body language, getting down into a child's level, using that slow rhythmic breath of your own, just that posture that communicates, again, safety and care towards the child. Finding opportunities to get in rhythm. There's research that supports that when we're physically in sync, we also are more likely to be socially in sync. And so finding ways, whether that's getting into rhythm by how you're moving, if a child's walking in pace with them, finding, you know, rhythm-based games that you can play together, it can help us be socially attuned and also can help be a soothing experience for the nervous system. I'm going through these a little bit quickly because I want to make sure that I'm cognizant of our time, but all of this information will be coming to you in a handout as well. We've talked a bit already about meeting the body needs, but getting curious and, again, just thinking about, could it be that something's going on with their body that's contributing to these behaviors of distress? Validating emotions is the next step. It means so much to feel like somebody sees you, and that children have a chance to feel seen and secure. And sometimes, if met with invalidation, children might escalate. So, you know, there might be things that, like I mentioned earlier, the scratchy tags, we might not understand or relate to the thing that prompted the behavior of distress. But if we respond with invalidation, or like, that's no big deal, it's fine, you know, try to hurry them along and, oh, it's okay. Some kids react with more escalation because they find that distressing, and they kind of double, like, no, I am, it is a big deal. And so wanting to really validate that experience, and it helps kids feel seen and affirm that what they're experiencing is real. And reminding kids that all of their feelings are okay. So, you know, we want to create space for them to have the experience to lay down that groundwork that I can be sad and then I can be okay, and I can be frustrated and then I can be okay, so that they have that that sense that they're going to be okay at the end of what they're experiencing. The fifth one is help with sense making. And so what I mean by that is, again, we might see something like this where somebody is expressing some very distressed behavior, but what's going on inside of that might be something that's really complicated that they might have a hard time articulating and putting into words. And so, you know, I got in trouble, I don't understand why. Maybe it's because you don't like me. What if you don't like me? That's a scary thought. If you don't like me, then you might not help me. And if you don't help me, then I'm alone. And so there might be this whole swirl of experiences happening that kids have a really hard time making sense of. And we need to be able to articulate and integrate that experience into our nervous system so that it doesn't just stay there and stay stuck. So we have to somehow make sense of what happened so that we can integrate it. And so one of the ways we can do that is using something called guided scripting, or as Kim Barthel calls it, sports casting, but it's kind of externalizing that self-talk and finding ways to make sense of what just happened. So it involves identifying the issue, stating the reason, inviting a strategy, and giving some feedback. So we often use this kind of self-talk without realizing it when we're regulating. And some kids might not have developed that skill to do that internally yet. So we come alongside and we can scaffold it for them by doing it out loud alongside them. So, you know, if I'm doing something like this, where I'm giving a presentation, if I feel nervous, I might have an inner experience going, whoa, I'm talking really fast. I think maybe it's because I'm nervous. Okay, I should take some deep breaths. Okay, yeah, that worked. Now I'm talking slower. So I'm doing that process internally, and kids who may not have internalized that yet benefit from somebody helping them along through it. And it works well when we can be cognizant about our nonverbal communication and also about trying to use statements and observations and stories instead of questions or commands, because a lot of kids find questions and commands quite escalating. So this is an example. So let's say you're making dinner, kids are playing in the other room, everyone's excited, voice volumes are getting high, it's a really busy game, and one of the kids, Jane, really wants to play, but she keeps retreating into the kitchen where you are, and each time she tries to join in, she gets more and more frustrated, and you're watching this build, and she's getting more and more frustrated. So you might say something like, Jane, I see you really want to play, but it's hard to join in. That's frustrating. You can state the reason. It's pretty noisy in there. And finding a strategy might sound like, I remember when you used ear protectors at the birthday party last week. That was such a good trick. We have ear protectors here too. And giving feedback could sound like, wow, you kids played together all the way till supper time. Those ear protectors sure helped. And the content of this will vary depending on your child. Some of you might be listening to what I just said and think, my kid would hate that. That's too much language, or they would not like that. So you can adjust based on the child that you have gotten to know and that you're working with. It might just be more nonverbal communication or putting the ear protectors out there. So it's an invitation. So you'll have to gauge some of that, but that's the process of using that guided scripting that helps kids make sense of their inner world. And this is a book that was put together by New Directions and the Canadian Centre for Child Protection that also does a nice job of explaining to kids that whole fight, flight, freeze response and making sense of what happened in my body just now and what is my amygdala, what is it doing? And so I've seen this book, it's so cute hearing kids as young as like 3 and 4 be like, my amygdala. So it's a good tool for just explaining to kids sometimes that experience that they're having. And then the last step here, we're coming short to the end, I know, is about re-engaging through play. And so afterwards, what do we do? And sometimes when kids are having trouble with regulation, sometimes they're having a hard time getting out of it because they just get kind of stuck. They're not really sure how to bridge. I just had this experience, I was in distress, and now I'm kind of not, but I don't really know how to get back into what I was doing or how to get out of this loop. And so we can bridge that. And if we can do it playfully, then that can be a good access point for kids. We know that adults tend to favor understanding things through talking. If we want to debrief, we want to talk through it. We want to talk about what just happened. That's kind of how we bridge what just happened with moving on and doing the next thing. But kids regulate mostly through play. And so they'll do that bridging through play. And the time frame of that might really fluctuate. They might not be ready to do this re-engagement piece right away, like step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They might need some time. And so it's important that this happens when both parties are ready, because you might also not be ready yet either. And so it doesn't have to be with you. Sometimes kids move on faster from those experiences than we do. Kids might have had, behavior of distress, and now they're calm and they're ready to go. And you're like, I'm not, my body's still really activated. And so it could happen with somebody else. That's okay. So it doesn't have to be with you. But just remembering that, these are moments of shared joy, repairing that connection. Laughter is a really good medicine for our nervous system. And also it's an opportunity to complete the stress cycle if you can do something that helps get that stress energy out of your body. And there's been research about just the impact of play on brain development and wiring. And so there was a study that was done in 2016 with children who had neurodevelopmental disabilities and who were having a lot of distress behavior and a lot of trouble with regulation. And on brain scans were shown to have a really active amygdala. They had a lot of activity in the amygdala and in the stress response centers in the brain. And then they did an intervention with their parent that consisted of playing with their child. And so doing that relational connected play. And they found that when they did brain scans later, there was less activity in the brain's alarm system and more activity in some of the relational centers. So it had kind of rewired how that circuitry was happening. So play is really powerful. So when we can come at things from a stance of play, that can be a really powerful tool as well. So I think we have a few minutes for discussion. I feel like I just zipped through so much information at you all. I hope that some of that was helpful and landed where you were hoping it would. And again, that there will be some resources coming and some additional places to find more information, because regulation is such a huge topic and indeed something that, will ebb and flow over the course of a child's life. And so it's not really ever a done, completed story. So, but thank you for your attention and for for joining me today. So I don't know if there's questions in the chat. We have a little bit of time here, but people are welcome to either ask a question or if they have thoughts about if there's anything that still feels kind of rough around the edges, or is there anything that's like, oof, that I'm going to take that and I'm going to try it, a gem that you're taking away. You're welcome to share that too. And if I can stop sharing my screen, I will.
Jen, did you notice any questions?
There doesn't seem to be any questions. Lots of thank yous. Fantastic presentation.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was awesome. You did it. In an hour, we all got something out of that. Thanks for putting that together and sharing your wealth of information on this topic. So many insights. The other thing I wanted to mention is if you have a chance to complete the survey, we so appreciate that. It gives us information for future workshops and just where you were at with this one. So we really appreciate it. Also, if you would like to become a member of the coalition, you can email Kim at coordinator@fasdcoalition.ca. Members will get all the information about different events coming up. So if you would like to get that directly, please feel free to join as a member. And just wanted to let you all know that our next workshop will be February 23rd, and it will be on sleep and FASD by Dr. Hanlon Dearman. So we're really looking forward to that one. Hope you all have a great afternoon and good weekend and can get some regulation in. And we'll see you next time. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.